Hello and welcome to this week's Wednesday Wisdom with me, Liz Marden from Nature's Therapies. So what I thought we'd talk about this week is the difference between desensitisation and flooding. So both are terms that behaviourists might use when working with your animal. Okay, so we can have a little look at what they are and the big difference between them and why one is preferable in modern dog training using positive, kind reward methods as opposed to old school punishment training. Okay, so let's have a little deep dive in. Okay. So, as I said, we are going to talk about the big difference between desensitisation and flooding. Before we can do this, we need to have a little look at the term thresholds. So when we talk about a dog's threshold, we're talking about their ability to cope with different stimuli, okay? So their ability to cope with something that they find worrying. So that could be another dog, it could be a car, it could be a person, it could be anything, okay? So each dog's threshold to their trigger, so their thing that makes them react, is completely unique, and the size of their circles will change with each individual and with each trigger. So for one dog, they may require a really large distance away from other dogs in order to cope, but they might have a much smaller threshold around people, or none at all. They might be able to completely cope with people. Whereas another dog might have quite a short threshold with people, but perhaps, or with other dogs, but perhaps a larger one with people, okay? So the way the thresholds work is I've broken them down into 3 circles for you. So in the middle, they are super reactive to the triggers. This is the red circle. They cannot focus on any commands you're giving them, and they cannot take treats or respond to your voice. They are completely over threshold in this moment, okay? So if we're looking at this being another dog, so if your dog is afraid of other dogs and you are in this bit, the other dog is going to be in this circle, okay? So imagine the other dog where my cursor is on this PowerPoint, okay? Your dog, when he's in this space away from the other dog, is too over threshold, cannot cope with what's going on, cannot listen to you, cannot learn, okay? The next one, the amber circle, your dog is very aware of the trigger and is finding it hard to focus on you, but is not completely reactive yet. So you might get them able to look at you every now and then. They might take the odd treat, but they're still finding it quite difficult. So remember, the dog in question is in the middle and your dog is now in the amber section, okay? Then we get to our green outer circle, okay? And your dog is completely unreactive to the trigger, but is aware it's there. So they've looked over, they've seen that other dog in the red bit in the middle there, and they've said, yep, there's another dog there, but they can cope with it. It's far enough away that they are able to cope with that dog being there. They can take treats, they can do commands like sit or recall or down or anything you can think of. They're completely within threshold, okay? So that's how it works. Your trigger is in the middle, okay? And you have different bands. So if you're in the red circle with your trigger, you cannot react. You are completely reactive, sorry. You cannot cope with what's going on. If you're standing in the amber, you're just about able to cope, but it's still a bit much for you. And if you are in the green band, you are completely able to cope, okay? So on the whole, we want our dogs to be in the green band in order to be able to learn. When we're looking at desensitisation, this works really well with counter conditioning, which is another behavioural term where you pair something scary, so in this scenario, a scary another dog, with something fantastic like cheese, okay? So that's what counter conditioning is. So desensitisation and counter conditioning work really well together, and they're often used together when we're working with our animals. Desensitisation involves gradually introducing that scary thing or the cause of your undesirable behaviour, whether that be fear or overexcitement. You're exposing the animal to it in levels that they can cope. So you're keeping them in that green band, okay? The animal is completely aware that the other dog is there, but it's at such a low level, so there's a big distance between you, that your animal can still cope, okay? Over time, when you're working with your animal, and this wouldn't necessarily be done in one session, it would depend completely on the animal, but over time, the thresholds would change as your animal is able to cope. So the green threshold would get much, much bigger, and you would technically be getting closer and closer to that dog, okay? So the red threshold would start shrinking, as would the amber, and the green would become much, much bigger until you end up with a tiny, tiny dot with the other dog in the middle, a tiny little bit of yellow around the outside, and then a massive, massive green bit. So you're getting right up to this other dog. That's desensitisation, okay? Really, really gradual. The animal is always kept within their threshold. So they're always kept in the green band where they're unreactive. So they're not completely losing their minds, but they are aware that the other dog is there. Now, in desensitisation, you might go into the amber every now and then to check your dog's progress and to push them on a bit further, but you're still keeping them in that point where they are able to cope, okay? That is the biggest thing with desensitisation. The animal is able to cope with what is going on, and they're learning that the scary thing isn't so scary. And like I said, you're normally pairing that with counter conditioning. When we look at flooding, however, just move my little box out the way. When we're looking at flooding, it's where we are putting the animal intentionally over threshold with a stimulus. So we're sticking them straight into that red circle and we're keeping them there, okay? So we're flooding them, we're throwing them right in the deep end, we're sticking them right in that red circle where they are reacting and they are over threshold, okay? The purpose of flooding is to expose the animal to that stimuli that triggers an unwanted reaction. So if we're talking about other dogs, it would be throwing them into a pack environment, so a group of dog environment, for a prolonged time. The theory behind it being that the animal will realise there's actually no real threat present, and then they will change their emotional response in the future and they will be fine with other dogs, okay? Now, it's not recommended as a method, as I said in the beginning, but some will claim it to have quick effects in resolving behavioural issues. Now, the problem is it can be very, very dangerous to do and can actually cause more and more long-term behavioural issues in the future, okay? Because what can happen when you're thrown over threshold right into that red stimulus moment, you can go into, or your animal can go into a state of self-helplessness where they just can't cope. So they just completely shut down behaviourally and they're not learning. So they're not learning that all these other dogs around them are really fun and fantastic. They are just absolutely terrified and they're sitting in their shell. And what that can then mean when you take them away from that situation is that they're even more terrified of seeing other dogs in the future because their last experience was too overwhelming. Okay, so that is the big problem with flooding, and I would never really recommend using it at all, especially when you're looking at fear-based behaviours. Okay, desensitisation is always the one I would go with. Flooding can have its uses in terms of if you are a professional and you know what you're doing, it can have its uses. I would never recommend somebody that's not behaviourally trained to work with flooding. It can work in scenarios where perhaps an animal is really fond of balls, for example, and you can put them in a room full of balls. So they're flooded by balls as such, and it can make that one individual item that they're a little bit tetchy about less. Okay, but again, can be really dangerous. If you've got a dog that's guarding, there are a lot better methods that you can use rather than that. So what can happen is then you have a super guarder that might guard all those balls. Okay, so flooding has so many risks with it, but is sometimes used in behaviour. Okay, so recapping, desensitisation, we're working in that green section. Okay, so in that green barrier, they're aware that the thing that they're afraid of is there, but they are able to cope, they're able to focus on you, they are learning. And then gradually, over a long time with some animals, we would gradually get them closer and closer to the thing that scares them, allowing that green barrier to move with us, occasionally dipping a toe into the amber barrier to see how they're getting on and if they can cope with a closer distance, until we can get them up close, and then we can work on that, but it's done over a long period of time. Flooding is chucking the animal in the deep end right next to the thing they're afraid of. So a common example would be shoving them in a pack environment, and then the theory being that they would just learn. However, unfortunately, that's not always the case. Okay, so I hope that explains in a nutshell the difference between flooding and desensitisation. But if you've got any questions, please do pop them into the comments. If you are watching on YouTube, please do hit that subscribe button. It's completely free and will mean that you are able to see my videos much more regularly. And yeah, I hope that helps you guys. Next week, we will look into different learning theories, okay? But that's it for today. Desensitisation and flooding and the difference between them, with a little bit about thresholds to begin with.